Please welcome David Bratzer, The Key to Criminal Justice Reform, Ending Drug Prohibition.
Thank you very much. I'm here today to talk about the criminal justice issue of our time, and that is prohibition. So specifically, the criminal prohibition of currently illegal drugs such as marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and other substances. Now, this is my first time actually speaking in the city of Victoria, and I'm very proud and pleased to be able to speak to this topic here today. But I want to focus not on what's happening here in Victoria, but rather take a sort of a broader glimpse at what some of the consequences are around the world of this international policy of drug prohibition. And so we can look, for example, to Mexico, where since 2006, when President Calderon ramped up drug law enforcement in that country, over 22,000 people have died in violence between the state and the drug cartels, or often between the drug cartels themselves. Many of these people were criminals, of course, but many of them were police officers, soldiers, journalists, politicians, innocent civilians who were caught in the crossfire. We can look at Jamaica, where in recent weeks, 76 people died in fighting for a slum in Kingston, where the authorities were trying to apprehend a wanted or an alleged drug lord who was wanted for extradition by the United States government. We can look at Brazil, where in 2009 we had two rival drug gangs that were fighting each other in a poor neighborhood in Brazil, and in the process they actually shot down a police helicopter. So this is the level of sophistication or training and equipment that some of these gangs have. And of course we can also consider Afghanistan, where Canadian soldiers are being murdered in an insurgency that is funded in part by profits from opium production and heroin trafficking, at the very same time as in Africa, where in many countries in Africa there is an enormous unserved market for opiate-based pain medication. And lastly, of course, we can consider the United States, which is the main proponent of this policy of drug prohibition. And we can look at what that policy has brought in that country. So over the course of 40 years, the United States government has spent $1 trillion, $1 trillion US taxpayer dollars on this policy. Over 39 million arrests for nonviolent drug offenses have been made. The United States now has 5% of the world's population, but over 25% of the world's prison population. So it has resulted in a massive over-incarceration. And for what? At the end of this 40 years, today, in the United States, in Canada, and around the world, drugs, illegal drugs, are cheaper, they are more available, and they are more pure than ever before. So this policy of prohibition has been a public policy failure. And you may be surprised at some of the people who are actually coming out and saying this nowadays. For example, myself, I'm here today representing an organization called LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and we are a group of current and former law enforcement officers, including prosecutors, judges, corrections officers, and police officers. Myself, I'm a police officer here in the Victoria area. I should clarify that the views that I'm presenting here today, of course, don't represent my department, but they do represent the views of the 30,000 members of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition in over 86 countries. And we've come a long way. We were founded in 2002 by a group of 5 retired law enforcement officers, and they looked back on their careers in policing, and they were frustrated, and they carried many deep regrets because they had started their careers in this field with the good intentions of stamping out the problems of drug abuse in their communities through enforcement action. And yet 25 or 30 years later, these problems had only grown worse. And not only that, their communities had negatively suffered from the unintended consequences of drug prohibition. So for example, drive-by shootings and gang homicides became common as organized crime groups fought over local control of the drug markets. The HIV epidemic was certainly increased by the fact that many illegal drug users caught HIV by sharing needles. You can look at property crime rates, for example, which often spiked when hardcore drug addicts would break into cars or homes in order to get money to pay for their drugs. So I'll just take a moment here, and maybe in the audience, just show me sort of in terms of a show of hands, who here would support the legalization and regulation of marijuana, for example? Okay, it's just about everybody in the room. That's incredible.
It's Canada and British Columbia.
It's Canada. It's British Columbia. Okay, that's something from the audience. Let's talk about some other drugs. What about MDMA, or more commonly known as ecstasy? Who would support that? Okay, I see some less hands. And now, what about drugs that have a high potential for abuse? What about heroin or cocaine? Who wants to legalize access to those? Okay, so again, a mix, but certainly less than marijuana. Now, law enforcement against prohibition. Our position on this is interesting. We say that the more dangerous the drug, then the more reason that you have to regulate and control it. And right now, of course, that's not the case. Right now, the government has no control, and it is the violent criminal drug dealer on our street corners who gets to decide what the price is going to be, the purity of the drugs, where he's going to sell them, if it's going to be near a school, or God forbid, in a school, what advertising methods he's going to use. And these drug traffickers are not asking minors for identification. They are not suggesting to their customers that have problematic substance abuse issues that they should get counseling or treatment. They're not helping them with their housing or employment situations. So under a policy of prohibition, we have created these black markets that are essentially ruled by predatory drug traffickers. And the other thing, of course, when we talk about prohibition, is we're often distracted by the particular drug that we're considering at the time. But what I would suggest is that when we think about prohibition, focus on prohibition, and don't think so much about the individual drug, whether it's marijuana or cocaine, because the government could ban any substance where there is a demand for it, and it would create similar kinds of problems. So for example, take sugar, refined sugar, for example. Perhaps one day the government will want to ban that, and there's all kinds of reasons to do it. It gives you cavities, sugar addiction, can create mood swings, children have too much of it. There's all kinds of health and social costs from consuming too much refined sugar. But we have to ask ourselves, what would the consequences be if the government prohibited that substance? Well, I know that I'm not going to stop eating Snickers bars, right? And I'm sure many of the people in this room with a sweet tooth wouldn't either. So the demand would not go away. But what would happen is that criminals would move into that market and take over the production, the distribution of refined sugar. And so quickly what would happen in this black market is that this little packet of sugar that I got for $15 or $20, or sorry, that I got for free with my coffee this morning, this little packet of sugar would end up costing $15 or $20 on a street corner. And it would carry a risk of incarceration when I purchased it. So, and not only that, a kilogram of sugar, a kilogram of sugar, which cost me $5 when I bought it at the grocery store this morning, would all of a sudden, because the black market carries increased security costs and things like that, and a risk of incarceration and arrest, a kilogram of sugar would all of a sudden go for $30,000, much like a kilogram of cocaine does in Canada and the United States today. So this is the issue in terms of prohibition. And I really believe that ending prohibition is the key to criminal justice reform, if only from the financial perspective. It is easy for government to spend $1 billion, but it is difficult for government to save $1 billion. Okay, so you can look at the G8, the G20 that just happened in Toronto a little while ago. That cost at least $1 billion in security-related costs. It is easy to spend $1 billion, but it is difficult to save $1 billion. Right now, the United Nations estimates the worldwide market annually for illegal drugs is $320 billion. So I would suggest that if we legalize, regulate, and control drugs, we can save on prison costs, law enforcement costs, and other health and social costs. So in summary, I would encourage you with me to advocate for the regulation of the consensual adult behavior surrounding drug use.